Welcome everyone to my presentation. I'm just here for the t-shirt. This presentation about coping with imposter syndrome. Now, the first time I gave this talk, I was asked afterwards, or rather someone told me, they said, Sean, I really love your title. How did you come up with it? I'm not really sure. It just kind of came to me one day when I was doing laundry. So who am I and why am I talking to you? Other than the fact that I clearly have a lot of t-shirts. Um, all my life, my dad was a pilot, and I wanted to be just like him when I grew up. Believe it or not, that's actually a picture of me, a few decades younger and a few pounds lighter. About 14 years after that picture was taken, that little guy graduated from high school. He earned a private pilot license and then spent the next 6 months after high school in flight school, earning a bunch of other licenses, including a flight instructor certificate. And then he went off to college, where he graduated with a Bachelor of Science in Professional Aviation, and then stuck around the school for a few years, teaching new pilots and trying to gain enough experience to fly for the airlines. He spent the next few years building up a couple thousand hours in airplane, with another 2 to 3 times that in classroom instruction. He had a pretty good idea about what he was doing and where he was headed. But then you fast forward a little bit. And around the end of 1999, the early 2000s, I was trying to figure out where I wanted to go as a pilot. And I took a part time job helping my brother's web development company with some coding. And that was when that little guy kind of became this not so little guy in front of you today. Then you fast forward again. A couple of decades, and where I'm headed has changed quite a bit. I started the geek phase of my career with ColdFusion, and I'm still somewhat of a fanboy of the language, though I've moved again more to the data side of the house, and now I'm doing the DBA thing. I have a handful of certifications. I've spent countless hours reading about various tech that interests me and practicing some of it. I probably have a bit over, probably close to 70,000 hours of direct work experience in the tech realm. Uh, 25 years times probably 50 or 60 hours a week. Um, yeah, quite a few hours. So and that includes all but the hobby work that I've done throughout the years. However, you give me a week and I'd be pretty confident that I could teach you how to fly an airplane, or at least take it off and land it pretty easily. But if you give me that same week, I could probably teach you how to say hi to your computer, or get your computer to say hi back to you, rather. But really, since I'm a database guy now, I'd probably be much more apt to teach you the benefits of using Select Star. So, which brings me to our topic, imposter syndrome. First, we need to take a look, or we need to define it, and then we'll take a look at it from both a technical and a real world view. Hopefully, by this point, I won't have to convince you that it's not a good thing. And finally, we will talk a little bit about how to make that nagging imposter voice in your heads just shut up. Along the way, I'll share with you some of my personal experiences with imposter syndrome. So, before we can really talk about what imposter syndrome is, we really need to know what it is before we can talk about it. So, by one definition, imposter syndrome is the chronic feeling of fraudulence, self-doubt, and inadequacy. Often, you may think something like, you fooled everyone into thinking you know what you're doing, or maybe you feel a little bit very lucky to be where you are. Or you may tend to bury yourself in work so that nobody notices you. Or you may procrastinate because you can't be caught if you never start. Or you may also like to work alone because that way nobody can see you doing it wrong. And then an industry like ours has its fair share of very smart people. You just may simply feel not like you're not one of them. Personally, I've had the good fortune to work with some extremely intelligent developers. This has been great for learning new things, but it's been not quite so hot for my imposter syndrome. And one would think that with 30 times the experience as a developer, I'd feel a bit better about my coding skills than my piloting skills. But really, the biggest thing for me is at the end of the day, Nobody's caught me yet. I get to keep my job for one more day. So, in a nutshell, no matter what imposters have accomplished, they simply lack a belief in themselves. Back in the before days, in late 2018 or so, before COVID really turned our workforce upside down, about 10,000 tech employees at some of the largest tech companies in the world were asked the simple question, do you suffer from imposter syndrome? Over half of those employees said yes. They felt like imposters, including almost three-quarters of the tech employees at Expedia. Now, imposterism is a pretty common problem. One way to look at the imposter syndrome is to compare it to the Dunning-Kruger effect. If you aren't familiar with Dunning-Kruger, it's basically a theory about people, especially early in their careers, who have extreme overconfidence in their abilities. They haven't really learned how much they don't know yet, so they think they are absolutely crushing it. As someone learns more about their craft, they begin to realize how much they don't know before they begin to gain the experience and the competency or the competence that they thought they already had. But it's essentially the opposite of imposter syndrome, where there's an extreme underestimation of your abilities. You may have a good idea of how much there is to know, and you may think that you don't know nearly enough of it. That other people know a lot more than you do. When imposters do something good, there's always an excuse, like it was lucky or there was some mistake, um, or that it's all just a big lead up to something really bad about to happen. Studies have shown that imposter syndrome may begin to subside around the 10-year employment mark. But as someone who has been doing this for almost 25 years now, anytime my boss calls me into his office, I still get that, oh no, I'm about to be fired jitters. So it never really goes away completely. So there's really a sweet spot between the two, between imposterism and Dunning Kruger, where you have confidence in your abilities, but you still remain humble about them. You have a fairly realistic view of where you are. So, how can we spot imposter syndrome? What does it look like? Sometimes it's easier to get the point across by showing y'all a picture, and as is often the case, there's an XKCD for that. Even though you may be an actual expert within your community, you simply don't see yourself that way. Or sometimes you feel that every interaction with your boss is going to be the moment where you get fired. Or maybe you just feel like everyone else in the room is just a lot smarter than you are. So, Dr. Valerie Young is one of the leading voices on imposter syndrome. And in her book, The Secret Thoughts of Successful Women, she talks about some of the research she's done. It's a fantastic book that digs much deeper into imposter feelings than I can get into today. But I highly recommend this book. But don't let the title fool you. Imposter syndrome was originally thought to be something that was only experienced by women. But further research, and that was actually the angle that she took in much of this book. But further research showed that it affected men just as well. Pretty much anybody can be affected by imposter syndrome. But in the very beginning of the book, Dr. Young, before she was a doctor, talks about sitting in a master's class with a whole bunch of other very, very smart women. And another student was reading a paper written by two psychologists, Dr. Pauline Rose Clance and Dr. Suzanne Imes, titled The Imposter Phenomenon in High Achieving Women. She remembers sitting in this class and feeling like the essay was pretty much written about her. Until she looked around and saw that all the other women were nodding their heads like they felt it was being directed at them, even the professor. And then she was really amazed that these other people could think that they were the fakes, and she realized that there was a real problem. She organized a support group with these women to talk about their imposter feelings, and then it grew into workshops that constantly had to expand because more and more people wanted to attend. This ended up being a much larger issue than she originally thought it was. And then Dr. Young has spent most of her career studying imposter syndrome, and much of what you'll find on the subject has roots in her research and in the research of Drs. Clance and Imes. So Dr. Young began to notice some interesting patterns in the way different people experience imposterism. Some people procrastinated, but while some believed that if they couldn't, they believed that they couldn't fail if they never even started. Others felt that they couldn't fail if they never finished, or sometimes the same person felt both at the same time. She also noticed that some people felt as if they never took on a risk, they wouldn't fail. But they also believed that if they took a risk, they were probably going to fail. And then she also talks about using your voice. Sometimes people think that if they say something, people will think they're wrong. And sometimes, even if they know they're right, they won't say anything in case other people think they're wrong. She also noticed an interesting contradiction in work ethic. Some people believed that if they worked hard and failed, then they just weren't good enough. But at the same time, they were feeling that if they didn't work hard and they did fail, then they probably should have worked harder. And then she also saw uh, people who felt that they did things on their own because the others were just better than they were. But then if they helped one of their competitors, then sometimes they would feel like, and then they lost. They would feel like that it was, they messed up by wasting time helping the other person. So Dr. Young realized that every imposter has a somewhat distorted definition of competence, and they all define it differently. However, she recognized five basic types of imposters: the perfectionist, the expert, the soloist or the rugged individualist, the natural genius, and the super person. So, do you feel like when you've made a mistake in your work that it's a big failure? The perfectionist is focused on the details of how things are done. To them, even a small flaw in their work means a major failure. They feel that if everything isn't just right, then they just blew it. This failing may be something they've imposed on themselves, or it may be because of someone else's high expectations of them, like an overbearing parent. They may not like to delegate work because they feel that they should do it. They should be the ones to do it right. They often over prepare for a task, which usually results in excellent work, but sets up an inner expectation of perfection. So that when, not if, they do make their mistake, it's significantly amplified in their minds. Perfectionists also don't. They also often procrastinate, not because they don't want to do the job, but because they don't want to start the job until they know exactly how to make it perfect. So to overcome this, you need to work on understanding that some things just don't deserve total effort, and sometimes good enough is actually good enough. It's okay to fail. Uh, the world won't end. Uh, you have to also realize that you will ship software with bugs, but you can fix them later. It's more important to release a product than it is to hold back until it's perfect. The saying is, what is the saying? Pretty much, perfection is the enemy of done, and that is so very true. Also realize that your perfectionism may slow down other people who rely on you to get something done. It may cause the overall project to fail because other people need your stuff to complete theirs. So do you sometimes feel that you aren't smart enough to get the job done? The expert is focused on how much they know about a topic. Now, don't confuse them with a know-it-all. It's not that It's not that they're an actual expert in their topic, though they very well may be. But that they feel like they should be an expert. They just don't feel smart enough. They want to know everything before they're willing to take a risk. They always want to learn more or know more, and certifications are often a very big thing for them. This type of imposter is similar to the perfectionists, but they're more about the knowledge than the action. However, they never feel like they're qualified enough to do the job. To overcome this, you need to remember that nobody knows everything. Everyone has different strengths. You have to learn where your limits are and then realize that those limits don't make you weaker. And then respect your limits. Also, don't be afraid to ask for help. Remember, you also want to remember that even an expert still has a lot to learn. You can spend an entire lifetime learning something, and many people do, but there's always more to learn. So now, when you need help with a new task, are you afraid to ask coworkers because you think think that you don't know what you're doing. So the soloist is focused on who completes the task. They don't want to ask for help, or rather, they feel they shouldn't need to ask for help. And if they do, they see that as a failure on their part, even if they are praised for that work. A reluctance to ask for help can lead to taking longer to complete a task, and they may also they may try to avoid working with other people so that nobody will realize how clueless they actually are, in their minds at least. Virtual work suits this type of imposter very well, and they don't like to be around people anyway. This type of imposter probably did very well during the work from home phase of the COVID quarantines. To overcome this, you need to learn to recognize the value of the resources available to you and learn to evaluate which resources will be most helpful to you. Also, getting help is not a bad thing, it's not a weakness. And then also realize that your work doesn't have to be absolutely amazing to be useful. Even mediocre work can still be something positive to the rest of the project. So, do you sometimes feel that your job is easier for your coworkers than it is for you? That shouldn't your job be much easier to you? The natural genius is focused on how easy the task is. They have an over reliance on their inherent abilities and feel that they just aren't smart enough if the task wasn't easy. That if they were a real programmer or whatever, their application wouldn't be hard to write. They feel like a failure if they don't already know how something is done, or if they have to work hard to get it done. And sometimes, if they struggle too much with a task, they'll get disheartened and give up. To overcome this, it's important to realize that more often than not, things require effort, and it may take some time to be successful. That's not weakness. That's just simply learning. You aren't expected to immediately know everything about something, and just because you hit a roadblock or something is hard, it doesn't mean you're a failure. Practice, practice, practice. Like the perfectionist, your 10th try is going to be better than your first try. So, do you take on as many tasks as you can so that you can seem like you are getting things done? The super person is focused on how many roles they can juggle at the same time. They feel like they should be able to do it all on their own. That to be useful to the task, they have to be able to do every role and do them all well. This sort of imposterism is very often felt by working moms. These imposters are very susceptible to burnout because nobody can do the work of multiple people for very long. They were probably most impacted by COVID quarantine since there was nobody there to really keep their overwork in check. They could burn themselves out in relative silence. They probably quit pretty soon after coming back to the office because they were just simply exhausted. To overcome this, the first thing to remember is that it's okay to say no. Learn how to delegate and don't take on unnecessary tasks. This one is this is another one where you have to understand and respect your limits. You don't have to do everything on your own. You don't want to burn out. This type of imposterism also can send a bad message to the people who look up to you, like junior developers or maybe even your kids. So these categories have a lot of overlap, and most imposters probably fit into more than one of these groups. These aren't really hard rules, but they're just more of a common grouping of behaviors that Dr. Young observed. But ask yourself, which type am I? The more I've learned about imposter syndrome, the more I've tried to pay attention to my own feelings. And I'd say that I've seen pretty much each of these behaviors in myself, especially probably the perfectionist and the expert. So, who are the imposters? Most people who experience imposter syndrome are often intelligent, capable people who work in difficult fields, and IT definitely fits that bill. As I said earlier, it was originally thought that imposter syndrome only affected women, but later research showed that it affects men just as often as women. They do tend to see it. It does tend to affect them differently, but they still both feel it just as often. At some point in their career, about 70% of people have experienced imposter syndrome. So, quick story here. I originally began thinking about imposter syndrome several years ago. Back in 2012, a coworker of mine invited me to go to a big .NET conference. Even though that was way out of my wheelhouse, I didn't know a thing about .NET. There were some .NET non-.NET sessions that sounded pretty interesting, so I went. I knew exactly one person there, and that was my friend. I'd probably be asking you to date yourself if I asked if anyone ever used HomeSite. It was created back in the the mid '90s by Nick Bradbury, and was later sold to Alaire. Nick was the keynote speaker at this conference. At the beginning of his keynote, he mentioned his work with HomeSite and ColdFusion, and it was almost like he threw me a little bit of a lifeline of a topic that I actually had a clue about. So I gave him just a quick woohoo, uh, and then I was horrified to see that every head in that auditorium turned in my direction. So in my desperate attempt at self-preservation, I did the only thing I could do. I turned to my right and I looked directly at my friend. Now, I'm pretty certain that I'm probably the only person at that conference who even remembers that keynote, probably Nick included. But it definitely had a pretty big impact on me. I had a really good time with those developers at the rest of the conference. I met some really great people who often responded to me with, "Oh, you're that ColdFusion guy." So I wasn't as apparently clever as I thought I was, but I still made some very good connections. But when I got back home, I crawled back under my rock, and I didn't go to another major conference or participate much in any non-ColdFusion activities for the next couple of years. I was pretty humbled, and that was when I first learned about imposter syndrome. So at that time, I was the co-manager of the Nashville ColdFusion user group, and I recognized that I'd been feeling like an imposter for years. So I made up my mind to do a talk about imposter syndrome. There were two conferences coming up, so I decided to submit the talk to the second one and then practice at one of the user group meetings. Since I had missed the CFP for the first conference, I decided to attend anyway. Plus, there was a woman that was giving a talk about imposter syndrome. And so I figured I could go and listen to her and maybe pick up some ideas. I can remember actually sitting in her talk and realizing that I am in a completely different demographic than this woman was. I do not belong to any underrepresented groups who tend to experience imposterism more intensely, and I thought to myself, what right do I have to talk to anyone about imposter syndrome? And that was when I came to the very strange realization that I was actually having imposter syndrome about feeling imposter syndrome. So when I got home, I wrote up an abstract for my imposter talk and I submitted it to that second conference. Unfortunately, it didn't get picked, and my imposterism just kind of turned up another notch. I shelved the talk, and I didn't even talk about it for at least another decade until the very first time that I gave this talk. The point is really that everyone can experience imposter syndrome, and for many different reasons. So we've looked at what imposter syndrome is and what it looks like, but why is it a bad thing? So if imposter feelings cause so much stress and anxiety in a person, that can affect more than just them. For them, they may burn out on their job. The stress may make them sick. They may procrastinate or otherwise reduce the quality of their work and unintentionally build a poor reputation for themselves. They may develop self-esteem issues, and at the extreme end, they may become disgruntled at work, which further erodes their reputation. And this may cause them to miss opportunities that they'd be more than qualified to handle. Or they may fail to take risks that they really should. Now, for the employer, employees are there to get the job done. If they are doing a poor job or missing work, this may cause customer issues. And ultimately, that employee is either fired or they leave, causing the company to lose what would have otherwise been a pretty good asset. Plus, other employees will see this toxic behavior and it may affect them too. There's a lot of room for missed opportunities all around. So a friend of mine once referred me to a very awesome sounding job that I was well qualified for, and it checked all my boxes. It was a company name that I recognized, but wasn't 100% sure at the time exactly which one it was. I was excited and I began looking for my resume to update, but then realized that the job would have been working for someone who I'd read for years, and quite often found myself referring to when I was stuck on a problem. Any interview would likely include answers that were written by this person originally. So my imposter syndrome kicked in big time, and I just never even applied for that job. So, author and Elle magazine editor Farrah Store talks about her feelings about imposter syndrome. She reframes feeling like an imposter in a good way. She says it is kind of like an internal check valve. It says that you're being challenged, and when we're being challenged, that's when we make our breakthroughs. So, we've talked about what imposter syndrome is and how it can be harmful. So, what can we do to get rid of it? Before you can do anything, you have to recognize that there's a problem. And that problem is with your thinking. You're the one that's holding yourself back. Try to see yourself through the eyes of the people around you. If they keep telling you that you're doing a good job, you might want to try to start listening to them. The next thing is to be around other people. It helps if you can see what other people are like, especially if those people are in your field but outside of your regular circle. Go to conferences and meetups. Talk to the people there. This has been one of the biggest things that has helped me. And it's pretty well accepted that talking about your problems can be extremely helpful. Find someone you trust, someone who won't sugarcoat the things they say to you or be brutally honest in their assessment, but who will give you brutal in their assessment rather, but will give you honest feedback, friendly feedback, someone that you can trust. And then own your achievements. Make a list of the things that you've done. There's probably a lot more than you think. I started doing this a couple of years ago, and I've gotten much better at keeping up with almost everything I do in the day. And I've been kind of surprised that my list for this year is already over 300 lines long. Occasionally refer back to refresh your memory on the things you've accomplished. This is especially good for the end of the year review time, when you have to talk with your managers about what you've done over the course of the year. Then evaluate your strengths and limitations. Write down the things that you're good at. Write down the things that you need help with. Then make a note of who you can rely on when you need help with something. Then accept the fact that you don't have to know everything. It's okay to say that you don't know the answer. This is also a good time to try just-in-time learning. If you don't have an imminent need to know how to do something, don't worry about it. Just wait until you do need it. This will help you to not feel overwhelmed with all the things that need to be learned. So when I first gave this talk a couple of years ago, I made a joke about my Udemy account and how it probably looks like a shared account from a bunch of schizophrenic computer science students. Sadly, that set of courses has grown a little bit larger, but much slower than it used to. And I've still only watched a few of the courses. I still have way too many things that I want to learn and just not enough time to learn them. So you may have seen this graphic or one very similar to it, but it describes the reality of imposter syndrome pretty well. You may feel like you know so little and everyone else knows so much more than you do. The reality is that everyone has a different experience. Some people are brilliant in one thing while other people are brilliant in others, and they may not have much, if any, overlap. You see them on their best days, and you compare them to your memories of your worst days. That's not a fair comparison at all. When you begin to think like the image on the right, you begin shutting down your inner imposter. So also recognize that nobody is perfect. Mistakes will happen. It's normal. Fix the mistake and move on to the next thing. Recognize when you need a break. Now that you know you don't have to know everything and be perfect all the time, learn when you need to just chill. Simply relaxing and turning off your brain for a bit can be very good for you. Stop comparing yourself to other people. As I pointed out in the previous graphic, or the earlier graphic, you aren't any worse than anyone else. You just have different skills and experiences. And most people don't like to talk in front of other people. That's pretty natural. I'm still pretty terrified up here. When I was a flight instructor, I taught in front of classrooms of students, and I didn't have any problems with that. But presenting in front of fellow geeks has been a bit intimidating. But I forced myself to do it. This is now around the 8th time, I think, that I've given a conference presentation, and only 3 of those have been virtual. All the others have been live. I'm nowhere near as good as most of the other people I've seen, or even that I know I can be, but I've made a decision to keep trying to get better at it. Plus, you usually get some cool swag for doing it. Now, If you've been doing this for any length of time, you've probably gained a fair bit of knowledge from some of the more recognized names in the community. People who regularly blog or speak or are simply well-known names because of their activity. Some of these people may have been built up into a bit of a celebrity in your field, and rightly so. They've made themselves a name in the pantheon of geekdom, whether they meant to or not. Some of these people may be in this room right now. You may not feel like you're able to talk to someone like that, or that you simply aren't on the level to have a conversation with them, where you don't want them to think that you're an idiot. My advice to you is talk to them anyway. So, story time again. Back in 2015, I went to another of the CF summits here in Las Vegas, and on that first day, I met some very amazing people, and I was having a real blast. The group invited me out to dinner, and I was a bit apprehensive about going because these were very smart people, and I figured how they wouldn't know how clueless I was if I wasn't with them. But despite my imposter syndrome, I decided to go anyway. As we were getting ready to head out, another person messaged the group that they'd like to join us too. Now, over the years, I've had numerous problems that have led me down the rabbit hole of Adam Cameron's blog. And I think it's fair to say that he's one of those well-known voices in the ColdFusion community, even though he isn't as prolific as today as he was back then. And so when I found out that I was about to have dinner with a celebrity, my imposter syndrome, which was already hovering around a 9 or 10, cranked way, way, way up past 15, and I nearly bailed on dinner again. I'm extremely glad I went. I have to admit that at dinner, I was a bit starstruck, but I was just waiting for Adam to roll his eyes and point out how daft whatever it was that I was saying was. It would be humiliating to have one of the biggest names in the community call me out for being a fraud. But he didn't. After dinner, on the way back to the hotel, some of us stopped at one of the sitting areas to have a beer and chit-chat for a bit. So the conversation was very good, and nobody seemed to think that I was an idiot. Eventually, only Adam and I were left, and we continued the beer drinking and the chit-chatting, and not only did I survive, but I seemed to have held my own quite well. We repeated the exercise for dinner the next night. I found him to be just as knowledgeable as I thought he was, but also very engaging and friendly. Meeting him was the highlight of that conference for me. And though we live a quarter of the way around the world from each other, when we found ourselves in the same venue, he's been someone that I've enjoyed hanging out with again. And I'm sure we'll share another beer or two the next time we meet up too. So again, meet your heroes. They're people too. And you might even make new friends. But meeting those heroes is a great way to prove to yourself that you are a lot smarter than you think you are. So after you've gone through all of the things above, reframe your views. Take an honest look at yourself. You can't begin to quiet down the inner imposter voice until you make the conscious decision to begin looking at yourself in a more positive light. And then learn to BS a little bit. That will help you to better recognize when other people are BSing around you, especially when you're around a group of people. Imposters feel intimidated around BS, or it may make them feel even more clueless. Just remember that a lot of people aren't as knowledgeable as they like to sound when they're in a group. A little bit of skill in the art of BSing can carry people a long way. And then finally, remember that you are not alone. You might be surprised by some of the people who feel the same way you do. That's a pretty hefty list of actors, musicians, writers, athletes, poets, a Supreme Court justice, and even a former First Lady. Pretty big names. And I'm sure some of y'all have heard of most of those names. There's some very famous people that feel like frauds themselves. Now, around the time of Star Wars Episode 1, Natalie Portman, who some of y'all may remember from that movie, became a freshman at a little school that some of you may also have heard of, Harvard. As you know, as far as I know rather, that's not exactly a trivial school to get into. And she says that she was concerned that people would think that the only reason that she even got into Harvard in the first place was because she was just some dumb actress. So in 1989, Jodie Foster won a Best Actress Oscar for her role in The Accused. She was up against some extremely stiff competition. Glenn Close, Sigourney Weaver, Melanie Griffith, Meryl Streep. But in an interview after she won, she said, when I won the Oscar, I thought that it was a fluke. I thought everybody would find out and they'd take it back. They'd come to my house, knock on the door, say, "Excuse me, we meant to give that to somebody else. That was supposed to go to Meryl Streep." And then, funnily enough, around the same time, Meryl Streep, who is one of the most recognized and rewarded actors of all time, was also having a little bit of her own imposter syndrome. She said, "You'd think, why would anyone want to see me again in a movie? And I don't know this. I don't know how this. I don't know how to act anyway. So why am I even doing this?" This is Meryl Streep. So one of my one of the best personal anecdotes about imposter syndrome that I've come across is from author Neil Gaiman. He has previously spoken about his own imposter syndrome, and when talking about how he's dealt with it, he relates a story that happened to him. He says, "Some years ago, I was lucky enough to be invited to a gathering of great and good people, artists and scientists, writers and discoverers of things. And I felt that at any moment they would realize that I didn't qualify to be there among these people who had really done things. On my second or third night there, I was standing at the back of the hall while a musical entertainment happened, and I started talking to a very nice, very polite elderly gentleman about several things, including our shared first name. And then he pointed to the hall of people and he said words to the effect of, 'I just look at all of these people and I think, what the heck am I doing here? They've made amazing things, and I just went where I was sent.' And then I said, 'Yes, but you were the first man on the moon. I think that counts for something.'" And Neil says that made him feel a little bit better. I mean, if Neil Armstrong can feel like an imposter, then maybe all anyone can do is just the best that they absolutely can. So I can't tell you to stop feeling like an imposter. I really wish it was that easy. I wish someone had told me that I wasn't a fraud, and I had just thought, "You're absolutely right." But unfortunately, that's not how it works. But that's something that everyone must convince themselves of. The best that I can tell you is to remember actual frauds don't have imposter syndrome. So I was originally going to wrap this up with the statement that you've got this. But that's not from again, that's not for me to tell you. That's something you've got to convince yourself of. What I'll say instead is open your door, look around, determine who you want to be, and then take your step.